I think there's a number of reasons to think he's not going to change course at this moment. I do think that he absolutely could, if he believed it was the politically advantageous thing for him to do. I just don't see signs that he's leaning that direction right now.
Yeah.
If he's president again and another Parkland happens, I think all bets are off. And in fact, especially if he's president again and Republicans control Congress, because if there's anyone who could pass significant gun control, it'd probably be a figure like Donald Trump.
Sure.
In a party like the Republican Party, because if he were to become president again, he would have so much sway over what the party does. I mean, he already does right now, obviously. That and I don't think he's obviously considered doing this in the past. It had honestly the main reason that the red flag proposal never got through at the time was because the first impeachment happened.
Yeah.
Just after he was considering supporting that. So that was the bigger impediment to it than any sort of, I think, lobbying from the NRA. There was lobbying, and it is better for the NRA to have, or the gun rights movement, whatever organization is going to be representing it moving forward. And it's still, I think, the NRA by and large, especially for Trump right now. But it's better for them to be in the room than to be yelling from the outside, and that has a lot of influence. But ultimately, I think it was more of I'm not going to work with Democrats to pass something while they're trying to impeach me.
Yeah, well, I think being in the room is important, and I think that is really where the NRA has failed the gun rights movement in a lot of ways. I think that we had a healthier gun rights movement when we had a genuinely bipartisan National Rifle Association. The NRA caught the populism bug long before the Republican Party at large did, and before the Trump movement really even took off. And the NRA's conversion from being a single issue gun rights lobby organization into being a kind of Fox News adjacent, and they tried to launch their own little version of Fox News, all-purpose right-wing culture war organization has been really, I think, destructive for the gun rights movement. Now, the Democratic Party has undergone its own radicalization on the issue during the same time, so it's not as though there were a lot of likely partners on the other side.
Yeah, it's a push-pull thing, I think.
Yeah, it is. But both the Democratic Party, I think, was healthier when you had people like Harry Reid around who, were up and down the line partisan Democrats on every issue, but were also gun rights supporters, and an NRA who could interact with Democrats like that in good faith, where they could have, productive, mutually respectful, beneficial relations. Right now, even if there were a Democrat out there who took a relatively enlightened view of gun rights, could he really go to the National Rifle Association and say, let's talk about this? Could the NRA
maybe behind closed doors, but yeah, probably not at the annual meeting or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, because the NRA has really made the Democratic Party, among other things, a sort of totemic cultural enemy. And I don't think that's a super helpful place for them to be.
Yeah, and I want to get into that a little bit deeper because I think it speaks to the broader point here beyond just Donald Trump or Joe Biden or the NRA, and I think where gun owners and the gun rights movement, you have gun owners, then you have gun voters, then you have the gun rights movement. It gets smaller and smaller, and as you zoom out more, obviously, ideas become less salient among the groups, and there's so many people who own guns in the United States that a lot of them aren't going to agree with each other, right? We have, because I think what the NBC said, 52% of voters have a gun in the home. Associated Press put the number of American adults with a gun in the home at 46%. That's 100 million plus people. So there's obviously not going to be commonality completely among all.
Yeah,
but
Charlie Cook and I did a podcast together for years and years, and we're both gun rights guys, but we actually disagree about some of the issues.
Sure.
And
that's bound to happen.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering, this situation that you mentioned earlier, this kind of station of guns as more of a cultural signaler in American politics, and the extremely polarized one, to the point where the Republican Party and the Democratic Party on the exact opposite ends on this issue, One, that doesn't necessarily seem like a good place to be, right? Because I mean, even just look at the Republican primary, right? Whatever happens with Donald Trump, he seems more on the side of the NRA and the gun rights movement than not at this point. But whatever happens with him, if you look at the Republican primary, nobody competed on this issue in that primary. Even the pro-life movement, which we're just talking about its weaknesses and Trump, turning on it to some degree. You had candidates trying to appeal to pro-lifers in the Republican primary, right?
Daily.
You didn't have any of that with the pro-gun side.
Yeah, I think it's an issue that's slightly dormant right now on the pro-gun side, in that you've got a lot of people who feel like they're basically winning. You've got a lot of people who are basically okay with the status quo. I think a lot of the hoops you have to jump through to buy a gun are silly, and particularly I've been in this epic dumb thing of trying to get federal permission to put a stock on a firearm our own, which makes it a short-barreled rifle, which is the special tax stamp and all that stuff, and it's hilariously idiotic what you have to do to do this. I mean, as though 45 ACP bullets fired from a gun with the stock on it were more dangerous than ones fired from a pistol grip. But even that being the case, I think a lot of us are basically satisfied with it.
I think that you hit that gun voters segment. There's the gun rights movement, where you can find a lot of criticisms, including criticisms of Donald Trump for things like the bump stock ban. Is sort of what I was trying to get a little bit go, because
I think
bump stock ban,
the people who have a positive agenda for change, want statutory change, who want administrative changes,
advocates
are not finding a lot of allies, even among relatively sympathetic people. So I think you have a lot of broader. What's that?
Then you go broader to the gun voters. And I think you're right. Honestly, this is probably why Donald Trump doesn't see a lot, but this may be a big reason why he didn't have a lot of competition on the issue from even Ron DeSantis or Nikki Haley or whoever else. Because I think gun voters don't look at Trump's record and think it was that bad. I mean, obviously he's got the Supreme Court nominations that led to Bruin. That's obviously his big, just like with pro-lifers, that's his big accomplishment. Not much else beyond that was super significant, but I think they just don't want more restrictions. I think they view as with, not getting sweeping new gun restrictions as a win in and of itself.
Yeah, and I also think some of the gun rights conversation has temporarily been swallowed up by the crime conversation, in that you've got a lot of people like me, for instance, who have spent a lot of time writing and talking about the need to take a more aggressive policing and prosecutorial stance toward crimes involving firearms. And that, my view is that we really should be prosecuting more straw buyers. We should dedicate more resources to trafficking. We shouldn't have a 60% dismissal rate for gun possession crimes in Philadelphia, which we do, which is up from 30% just a few years ago. So that's a policy choice. That doesn't happen by accident. And so I think that a lot of us who care about gun rights are also talking about the flip side of that issue, which is that there are times when, firearms need to be policed and parties that need to be kept from having them. That's, it's a perfectly reasonable thing to say a felon can't buy a firearm. It's a perfectly reasonable thing to say a 16-year-old can't buy a rifle or a handgun. These things don't strike me as being particularly controversial outside of a very small number of very committed ideologues. And the more we're talking, I think, about crime, I think that just saps some of the energy out of the conversation about, well, how do we get a broader, more liberal, more constitutional understanding of gun rights in general.